Service, if you want to follow along in the red book, it's number 346, 346. We're going to do it 3 times because it's so short and sweet. Good luck. Alright, wonderful. Here we go, ready? I'm ready for a miracle. Ready for a miracle, I'm ready for a miracle today. I've got my mind in tune for one, ready to experience one. I'm ready for a miracle today. My mind is open, ready to receive it. My heart is open all the way. I do accept a miracle. Do accept a miracle. I do accept a miracle today. I do receive a miracle. Do receive a miracle. I do receive a miracle today. I'm ready for a miracle, ready for a miracle, I'm ready for a miracle today. I've got my mind in tune for one, ready to experience one, I'm ready for a miracle today. My mind is open, ready to receive it. My heart is open all the way. I do accept a miracle. Do accept a miracle. I do accept a miracle today. I do receive a miracle. Do receive a miracle. I do receive a miracle today. I'm ready for a miracle. Ready for a miracle. I'm ready for a miracle today. I've got my mind in tune for one, ready to experience one. I'm ready for a miracle today. My mind is open, ready to receive it. My heart is open all the way. I do accept a miracle. Do accept a miracle. I do accept a miracle today. I do receive a miracle. Do receive a miracle. I do receive a miracle today. Have a seat. That was energizing.
This is our prayer box. It usually sits in the back of the church underneath the painting there. It's a place where we can put our prayers. They'll stay in here to receive the blessings of our church for about a month, and then they'll go to Unity Village, where Silent Unity will pray for them, pray over them for another month. Let us pray for a minute. Spirit within, Spirit among us. Hear these prayers, lift them up in our hearts. We give gratitude for all that you've given us and all that we will receive. Amen.
Thank you, Peter. And now Paul will read the daily word.
I am spiritually fulfilled when my unique gifts are dedicated to the service of others. I am a spiritual being expressing in limited human form. The expression is a combination of talents and gifts that are unique to me. As I learn to express those gifts, my life becomes progressively easier and more rewarding. But I soon recognize that focusing on the quality of my own life is too limiting for the spiritual being I truly am. Whenever my experience feels challenging, I turn my attention outward to find ways of serving others. It is a spiritual paradox that only by being of service to others I most fully express my unique gifts for myself. In serving others, I am fulfilling my highest spiritual purpose, and the energy of love with which I serve becomes my own experience. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. 1 Peter 4:10.
Thank you, Paul. Let us prepare ourselves now to say our sacred Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen.
We are the transformers of divine energy, bringing that energy into manifestation as love, as joy, as peace, as good things, moving in and through us as we embrace our path here in this world. So as you breathe in, aware, I am inspired. I am inspired. As you breathe out, I am focusing this divine inspiration. And with each breath, I move deeper into that awareness of the truth of my being. I open to the divine essence, the spirit, the allness, that I am. I am. Claiming that expression, that name of the divine. I am. And as we continue to release our consciousness, our ego awareness, our personality, that divine love, that divine joy, that divine power is ours to use, to express, to experience. For as this transformer, as we breathe in, we are first filled, and as we breathe out, it flows from us. Keep letting go. Keep moving deeper into that center. As your mind slows down, let's move into the silence of your own soul. In the silence. yourself just to the edge of that silence, holding your awareness of that divine energy and power. And allow your concerns, whether it is personal, whether it is somebody you love, a situation in your life, just allow that. Allow it to rest in that divine understanding, that divine mind that is all wisdom, that is all love, that is all power. We let go of our expectations of what the results, what the answer may be, and we allow this divine presence to be here in this situation. And let us reach out beyond our personal awareness and love and understanding out into our broader community. Joining with all of those who are in a place of this divine connection. And holding all those who are in darkness, who are in fear, who are in danger, who are in anger. Holding all in this divine love. We let go of our limitations and we embrace the elements. And we invite this divine power to move in and through us, live as us, speak as us, grow as us. And we take another breath as we come forward back. And we say thank you, and so it is. Amen. And we hear the voice of the choir in the back. Let the little children come. And, oh yes, so I'm going to go we present. So here is a friend of mine, Daniel Schenker, who's going to be our speaker this morning. So I've known Daniel's name because I listen to WLRH, and if you've listened over the years, every once in a while, in Sundial's Corner, we get to hear Daniel. He's also been active through various activities of the Interfaith Mission Service. So I knew his name, but I never met him until we were in a car together for many hours, Daniel and myself and my friend Jane, driving up to Wild Acres, where I've been going for several years for our Jewish, Christian, and now Muslim retreat. And so Daniel was one of the guest speakers last year, and so he rode up with us and rode back with us. And when I was looking out there for somebody to bring some information about Judaism, I thought, oh, I know somebody. So Daniel, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. When I was talking to Carol about preparing this, she suggested that perhaps handouts would be a useful thing to have. So I have two of them. When I passed out handouts in my class, if I had more than one, it was always like a test to the class to see if they could get both of them. So we'll send out the first one first, and then we'll send out the second one. So here's the second one.
Yeah, there's a little mercy.
And don't worry about the little one making noise.
Absolutely not.
No, we don't let it all in.
Absolutely not.
And so I believe Carol suggested I have about half an hour, and then we'll allow some time for questions. And I always think, well, that's an interesting challenge to talk about a 3,000-year tradition in the space of 3 minutes, but I do have some experience doing this, so I will take a shot at it. What I've done is I've given you 2 handouts. The first of these is entitled Judaism, a very brief introduction from a Reformed perspective. And this is kind of my standard handout when I do a presentation on Judaism. It's a distillation of my thoughts over the years to try to reduce everything down to about 1 page. And I will talk about some of the issues that arise here, but I really do think of this as sort of a reference for you, something that you might want to go back and look at later on if you ever wondered about certain points of the tradition. The second handout, which is headed simply Notes, are some things that I'm going to refer to specifically in the talk that I'm going to give this morning. And as I was thinking about this talk, I certainly want to convey a certain amount of information about Jewish tradition, but I also want to give you something of a feel for what that tradition is, to give you sort of a feel for what is Judaism really about, what are Jews preoccupied with, what are the things that matter. And so this talk that I'm going to do this morning is a little bit informal, and it's not too tightly structured, because what I want to do is raise a number of issues, and as I say, give you a little bit of a feel for things. So I'm actually going to begin with a sort of anecdote that has, strictly speaking, nothing to do with Judaism. Many years ago, a friend of mine was reporting to me a conversation that she had, and at a certain point came around to the topic of religion. And in the course of this conversation, the person she was talking to asked her, "Well, of what persuasion are you?" And my friend heard this question, and she knew exactly what she was being asked, and yet she thought the question was a little bit peculiar. And as she reflected upon it, she realized that the reason that she thought it was peculiar was because she was Catholic. And for a Catholic, the idea of religion being a matter of persuasion struck her as very odd, because she said, well, it's about a lot more than the beliefs of which you're persuaded. It's about the rituals of the church, it's about confession, it's about giving up certain pleasures at Lent, and so on and so on. But in other words, that the religion certainly involved beliefs, but there was a lot more to it than that. When I was teaching classes in literature that involved looking at sacred texts at UAH, we would say do a course where we would be looking at selections from the Quran or the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita. Very often the first questions that I would get from my students would be, well, what do Muslims believe? What do Buddhists believe? What do Hindus believe? And my response to that was, well, they believe certain things, but understand that when you ask that question, you're actually asking a very Protestant question. You're asking a question that comes very, very much from a Protestant Christian perspective, because in that tradition, belief is something that's very central. Christianity in general is somewhat distinguished from other faith traditions in that creed and belief have always been very central to it. In some senses, more so than in other faith traditions. And as I'm going to talk about in a moment, certainly more than in Jewish tradition. One of the things we know about the history of Christianity is that very early on in the tradition, defining belief and creed was something that was very important. And for example, in a lot of churches today, part of the Sunday service is a recitation of the Nicene Creed, right? Which I don't remember, I don't know, but we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and so on and so on. That emphasis on belief is one of the things that makes Christianity a universal religion. That is to say that if you subscribe to a certain set of beliefs, regardless of whether you're from Japan or Uganda or Mexico or whatever else, you're a Christian. Now, Judaism is not a universal religion. Historically, it's not a universal religion, and I think that's an important distinction to be aware of. And one of the reasons it's not a universal religion is that it's not primarily a creedal religion. So this sort of goes back to my initial point that one of the questions I always get is, well, what do Jews believe? And it's like my experience with giving presentations in a lot of churches is that one question, and you may have this and we can talk about it later, is, well, what do Jews believe about the afterlife? What do they believe about these different sort of theological issues? Now, there are creedal statements in Judaism. There are beliefs. For example, if you were to attend a Friday night service in a Reformed Jewish congregation, at a certain point you would hear the recitation of the Shema, which is actually a verse from Deuteronomy. The English translation would be, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." One translation, or "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone." Sometimes referred to as the watchword of the faith. It emphasizes the idea of the unity of God. It's historically very interesting because perhaps one of the reasons for the centrality of a Jewish statement about the unity of God is because of that 2,000-year history of living often in Christian communities where the understanding of the nature of God was Trinitarian rather than Unitarian. There were other instances of creedal statements in Judaism. In fact, if you look at your notes there's the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In the Middle Ages, the Jewish philosopher and Jewish thinker known as Maimonides, very, very prolific writer of commentaries, of sort of analyses of Jewish law and so on, at one point composed the 13 Principles of Faith. And I just reproduce on the sheet there the first 3 of these. "I believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be His name, is the Creator and God of everything that has been created. He alone has made, does make, and will make all things. I believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be His name, is one, and that there is no unity in any manner like Him, and that He alone is our God, who was and is and will be," and so on for 11 more. It actually kind of sounds like something out of the Nicene Creed, really. What's interesting about this is that probably most Jews aren't even aware of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. This is something that, it's not unknown, but it's something that's not central to the tradition. This is not something that's foundational. It's interesting, but it's not foundational. So the question then is, what is foundational? Well, what's foundational in Judaism is the idea of specific guidelines for living a holy life in everyday practice. Not large creedal statements, not theological statements, but the idea of very, very specific guidelines for what you do in day-to-day life to be holy. These guidelines are based upon Jewish law. Jewish law's ultimate source is Torah, which I should have written down here, but didn't, or I think I have it later on. Torah, T-O-R-A-H. Torah is a very interesting word in Jewish tradition because it can mean one of at least 3 things. It can mean the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the Torah. It can also mean the physical parchment scroll upon which the first 5 books of Moses are written and which are contained in the holy ark of every Jewish synagogue. So it can also be the physical object. Actually, in Jewish tradition, more than either of those things, it really means the sum total of Jewish teaching. So a lot of times, for example, you'll hear a rabbi say something like, well, I always want to spend a certain part of my week devoted to study of Torah. It doesn't necessarily mean just looking at something in the first 5 books, but it means studying the whole of the Jewish tradition. So as I said, the laws for governing behavior and governing practice are based upon Torah, and a huge amount of the intellectual and spiritual energy in Judaism over the centuries was invested in trying to draw specific guidelines out of these foundational texts of Jewish law. By the 3rd century CE, the rabbis had decided that there were actually 613 specific commandments that pious Jews were supposed to follow. Everybody knows the 10 Commandments, right? And if you walk into synagogues very often, you'll see some kind of representations in some part of the temple, there's one in Bnei Shalom, of the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. But Jewish tradition recognized 613 commandments, the Hebrew word being mitzvah, things that you're supposed to do. There were 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments. It was actually things that you were supposed to do and things that you were not supposed to do. So I thought I'd give you a little sample of the way this worked. If you look on the page there, 613 commandments, what follows is the text of 5 verses from the beginning, toward the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 6. The first of the verses is the Shema. These other verses are also almost always included in a Jewish worship service. And they go like this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Take to heart these instructions which I give you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign upon your hand. Let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So what the rabbis did was they looked at this text and they said, in this text, there are these specific commandments. To know that God is one, to love God, to love Torah, to say the Shema, which is the first line twice daily, to wear tefillin, phylacteries on the head, to bind tefillin on the arm, and to put a mezuzah, which is a little box that contains the text of this passage, to put a mezuzah on each doorpost. So this is an example of the way in which the tradition is looking at its sacred scripture, at its basis for law, and from that deriving these specific rules for behavior. So this is a few lines from Deuteronomy, and from it we get these 7 or 8 commandments. There are over 600 more that are drawn from elsewhere in the first 5 books of the Bible. The earliest reference to these 613 commandments appears in the Talmud. Now, if you look at the bottom of the page there, the Talmud is, along with the Tanakh, the 2 most important texts in Jewish tradition. The Tanakh is the Jewish Bible. Tanakh is a word that's made from an acronym from the first letters of the Hebrew words for law, prophets, and writings. The Hebrew Bible consists of the law, the first 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and in Jewish tradition, the first of the prophets is Joshua. The prophets go from Joshua to Judges, to Samuel, to Kings. Right? And then the rest of the Bible, Song of Songs, Job, Proverbs, and so on, are the writings. Right? It's a different arrangement. We can also, if we have some time, talk a little bit about why the arrangement is different in the Jewish Bible than in the Christian Bible. That is one of the primary sacred texts, but the other primary sacred text is the Talmud, which is a very challenging work. It really has been at the center of Jewish tradition for most of the past 2,000 years, though, for example, in the Reform movement, which I'm a part of, it has become, for various reasons, less central. It's sort of, the old joke about Catholics is that they didn't read the Bible, right? Protestants read the Bible, but Catholics didn't read the Bible because Catholics depended upon church tradition. That somewhat applied to Jewish tradition as well, that Jews weren't particularly focused on reading the Bible. They were very focused on the Talmud. And let me explain a little bit why this is. One of the things to understand about Jewish tradition is this belief that when Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive the law, it wasn't just the Ten Commandments, it was the entire law. When Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive Torah, he received both a written Torah and an oral Torah. The written Torah is the Bible, the written text. The oral Torah is the sum total of all present and future interpretations of the written Torah. Right? And that's important, the sum total of all present and future interpretations of the Torah. Well, how could that be? Well, the way it could be is the same way that there are references to events in the first 5 books of the Bible that happened after Moses died. Now, by the late Middle Ages, this became sort of the opening for what we would want to think of as modern criticism of the Bible, because people would look at that and say, wait a minute, Moses couldn't have written about these events because he'd already died. The pious answer was very simple. Well, Moses had prophetic powers. So of course he knew the things that were going to happen after he died. So the fact that there are references in Deuteronomy to kings who lived after Moses is not a problem. By the same token, an interpretation offered of a certain biblical text by an esteemed rabbi in 13th century Iraq was already there. It was already known about, right? So the oral tradition is something that Moses received, and it's already there, and when that interpretation is made, we can accept it because we know it is actually something that was foreseen by God and transmitted from the human to the divine on Mount Sinai. This is sort of the pious view of it. The more skeptical view, of course, is to say that it was a way for rabbinic authorities to reinforce their authority. Because if you say that, well, by making this interpretation, is really not me saying this, but it is part of this oral tradition that has really been there since the beginning of time, and only now is the moment that it's right for this statement to emerge. Well, for many centuries, the written Torah and the oral Torah existed side by side. But around the year 200 CE, it was decided that this oral Torah needed to be written down. Nobody knows exactly why this decision was made or how this decision was made, but one speculation is that it was during a period of intense persecution, and there was concern that if it weren't written down, that somehow the tradition would be lost. But the upshot is that over a period of about 300 years, from about 200 CE to about 500 CE, in 2 places, in the Galilee region of Palestine, and then later in Babylon, in present-day Iraq, this oral tradition was written down. And this oral tradition, which is basically a commentary on Jewish law, is what's known as the Talmud. The Talmud is divided into 63 sections, more or less topically, sometimes less topically. The real sort of eye-popping fact about the Talmud is that it runs to 6,000 pages. It's very big. The other thing that's interesting about the Talmud is that if you look at a page of Talmud, it looks like what today we would call hypertext. Because unlike the Bible, it's not just like, a page of text with, the lines following one after the other, but it's sort of text boxes on the page. So there's sort of a main text box, and then there are sort of text boxes around the side. This is the way it's been printed since the Middle Ages. So it's commentaries on commentaries upon commentaries. So what I have for you, I think this is on the back page now, is a little section of this. And again, I want to show you this because historically, this has really been where the action was, spiritually and intellectually in Jewish tradition. And again, the idea is that what matters is what you do. What you think or what you believe is not as important as the way you live, because it's your actions in which the holiness of the human-divine relationship exists. I'm just going to read a little bit of this to give you a feel for it. Notice some Hebrew terms here. The Talmud is composed, traditionally it's understood as being composed of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Mishnah and Gemara are respectively Hebrew and Aramaic words that mean something like study. The Mishnah is the older part of the Talmud, probably composed in Palestine at the beginning of that 300-year period. The Gemara was the commentary on the Mishnah, which is, say, the commentary on the commentary, that was composed largely in present-day Iraq. Present-day Iraq was, for centuries, really the center of Jewish learning. So this has to do with what you eat on festival days, right? With regard to an egg that was laid on a festival, Beit Shammai, now Beit is the Hebrew word for house, Shammai was the name of an early medieval rabbi who was so influential that he became sort of the founder of a school of legal interpretation. The opponents of the house of Shammai were the house of Hillel. Hillel is a name that might be more familiar to you, that on university campuses, if there's like a sort of a Jewish student group, traditionally they're called Hillel societies. But Hillel was the other school of legal interpretation in the early Middle Ages. The house of Shammai was famous for being very strict and very conservative. The house of Hillel was famous for being more liberal and open-ended about things. So Beit Shammai says it may be eaten even on that day, and Beit Hillel say it may not be eaten, as the Gemara will explain at length. Apropos this exceptional case in which Beit Shammai are lenient and Beit Hillel are strict, the Mishnah cites additional halachot. Halakha is just a Hebrew word that means tradition. It literally means a way or a path. Cites additional halachot of the festivals in which this unusual phenomenon occurs. Then it sort of goes on with a discussion about that. Then I'm going to drop down to the Gemara paragraph. So the Mishnah is sort of answering that question. Well, on a festival day, is it appropriate to eat a certain food? And it turns out that, well, some rabbis said yes, and some rabbis said no. The interesting thing about the Talmud is that it preserves all of the debates. It doesn't necessarily resolve them. There's a sort of strange kind of open-endedness to this. The Gemara inquires, with what case are we dealing with in this Mishnah? If we say that the Mishnah is referring to a chicken that is designated for eating, i.e. one planned to slaughter and eat a chicken that laid an egg, what is the reason that Beit Hillel prohibit eating the egg? Is it that the food has been separated? The entire chicken is considered food as it is designated for eating, and this egg is simply a part that has become detached. Just as one may partake of the chicken itself on a festival, the egg should likewise be fit for consumption. Okay? Now, one of the takeaways from this is this seems to be incredibly nitpicky and obscure. But that's sort of the whole point. That even something as seemingly everyday and ordinary as when you should eat a chicken or an egg, or literally what's the relationship between the chicken and egg? Is it part of the chicken or is it detached from the chicken? But this is the sort of thing they were concerned about, because it's this idea that every little thing that you do matters, because that's the essence of holiness. It's in your smallest actions. Big beliefs, they're okay, they matter in some way, but if you don't enact those things in every aspect of your life, you are not fulfilling the commandments. So, one of the things that this sort of specificity does, well, let me just say one other thing about that. A lot of this really is obscure, as I mentioned, sort of the Reform movement, a lot of sort of contemporary Jewish movements don't really pay a lot of attention to this anymore. The Orthodox tradition does tend to pay more attention to it. They're aware that some of these things really are obscure, but there is an argument that's made that focusing your mind on these issues, even if they're not immediately relevant, is sort of orienting you spiritually in the right way. That reminding yourself that the small things really matter by looking at texts like this is in and of itself a worthwhile objective to have. Now, one of the things that this sort of specificity does is it kind of takes us back to that issue of Judaism as a more sort of particularist as opposed to universal religion. One of the things that we can say about Judaism, aside from being religion, is a religion and involving certain religious practices, is that over time it also became a kind of ethnicity. Right? It became a kind of ethnicity because of these very, very particular practices. The most obvious being dietary laws. In The Merchant of Venice, in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, one of the things that separates Shylock from the other Venetians is he can't eat lunch with them. Right? You can't share food with somebody. That sort of separates you and leaves you in some other place. Judaism developed this sort of separate set of folkways. It develops even separate languages. That the two large ethnic divisions of Judaism in the Middle Ages were those between Central and Eastern European Jews, who were called the Ashkenazim, and the Mediterranean Jews, who were called the Sephardim. That the Eastern European Jews had their own language, which was called Yiddish, which was based on medieval German. The Jews in the Mediterranean also had their own language, which was based on medieval Spanish, called Ladino. And I think the important point there is that not only did the Jews come to see themselves over time as sort of a separate ethnic group, but that's the way they were perceived by the people that they lived among. There's a sense that they're not just a separate religion, but they're sort of, and this is a term that's kind of fallen out of favor for various reasons, but they're sort of a separate race, that they're somehow genetically different, they're different culturally, they're different in their language, they're just sort of a separate group from us. There's also a third element that I want to introduce here, and that is that Judaism over time has also been a nationality. It's been a religion, it's been an ethnicity, and it's been a nationality. Now, the nationality, of course, dates originally from the biblical period. The word Judaism comes from the name of the patriarch Judah. It's a name that eventually gets attached to one of the 12 tribes, the so-called 12 tribes of Israel. That group has a particular territory had a particular territory around the city of Jerusalem. That territory eventually becomes the primary Jewish kingdom. That kingdom exists in greater or lesser degrees of independence for several hundred years until Roman times, when in the early 2nd century CE, the Romans, having suppressed at least 2 major Jewish rebellions, decide to exile Jews from the land of Judea. At that point, all Jewish national aspiration comes to an end, and in fact, even the idea that there should be a Jewish nation becomes something that's actually sort of suppressed, because there's this sense that based upon the experience that the Jewish nation had had, especially with the Romans, this didn't seem to be a very productive way to go. And so for centuries, the idea of Jewish nationhood becomes a kind of nostalgic, almost sort of a nostalgic fiction. At the end of Passover Seders, even today, people say, next year in Jerusalem. It's not necessarily this idea that, well, next year you will be in Jerusalem, but maybe next year the Messiah will come and the world will change. And pious Jews, even to this day, believe that the only way that you could ever have a return to Jewish nationality would be one that was led by a Messiah figure. One of the things that we know, of course, because we have the benefit of 20/20 hindsight in history, is that, in fact, there is a Jewish nation today, that there's a state of Israel. And one of the great ironies of that is that by the middle of the 19th century, it was pretty much Jewish doctrine that Judaism was a religion, primarily, somewhat of an ethnicity, but definitely not a nationality. And I want to draw your attention to my last quotation on the back side of that page. Over the last century and a half, on 3 or 4 occasions, the Reform movement has gotten together and tried to formulate a set of principles. And the first of these took place in 1885 in Pittsburgh, and a statement of principles for the Reform movement emerged called the Pittsburgh Platform. And one of the things the Pittsburgh Platform includes is this statement: we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. And one might look at that from the perspective of the 20th century and say, oops, it's like things didn't turn out that way. And one of the things I think this is a reminder is that if you want to understand Judaism, you really do have to see it as this sort of dynamic interplay over history of these 3 elements. Judaism is a religion, it's an ethnicity, and it's a nationality. And these things have existed in different proportions at different times. Beginning of the 19th century, nationality was not a part of it at all. In the beginning of the 21st century, it's a part that bulks very, very large. And it's a kind of reminder of a certain kind of dynamism in Jewish tradition that I think sometimes there's a kind of, some churches, I think there's a stereotype of Judaism as this sort of fossilized religion. That it's the religion of the Pharisees in the New Testament, and basically nothing has happened since that time. One of the ironies of Judaism is that in some ways it's a newer religion than Christianity, in that the rabbinic Judaism that is the foundation of Judaism today, and has been the foundation of Judaism since the early Middle Ages, developed later than Christianity and was a function of the destruction of the temple. Christianity's theological roots are really in the Second Temple period and are very much tied up with the idea of sacrifice. When the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, for pious Jews, sacrifice in the temple is no longer possible. The idea of sacrifice is kind of pushed aside, and it's replaced with the idea that your relationship to God is not a function of doing something in a temple, it's a function of how you fulfill the commandments in everyday life. And that's something that gets formulated in that early Talmudic period. If we think about the situation of Judaism today, it's very interesting. Things are very different than they were even a century ago. The Jewish world has become more concentrated, less dispersed than it was 150 years ago. 150 years ago, the main Jewish communities were in Eastern and Central Europe and in the Mediterranean regions, and then there were Jewish communities that were scattered in various places around the world, from Latin America to India and even China and Japan. Today, the bulk of the world's Jews live in one of two places. They live in Israel or they live in North America. For various reasons, those other Jewish communities around the world have atrophied. World War II obviously put an end to the Eastern and Central European Jewish communities. A sort of sad irony of the establishment of the State of Israel is that that went a long way to putting an end toward the Sephardic Jewish communities around the Mediterranean. Each of those communities faces very different kinds of challenges. The challenge for the North American Jewish community is how to maintain a sense of Jewish identity, precisely because Jews have been afforded such access to mainstream culture. One of the evidences of that is that the rate of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews today is more than 50%. What's happening in the North American Jewish community is that ethnicity is sort of getting washed out. It's very, very different, say, than for my grandfather's generation, when there was a real strong connection to the old country. That's increasingly gone. That memory is beginning to fade. The challenge in Israel is very different. In Israel, obviously, there's no concern about assimilating to something different because the state is Jewish. But there the issue is, what is a Jewish state supposed to look like? And more specifically, how is a Jewish state supposed to behave? Jewish tradition put a lot of emphasis on ethical behavior, and you might say that not having a state kind of gave Jews the luxury of emphasizing the centrality of ethics. But when you actually have a state and you have power, and you can exercise that power, then the question arises, are you using that power wisely? And so certainly one of the challenges in Israel today is, how do you maintain an ethical Jewish state with these various pressures that are contingent upon you? The last thing I want to say, just sort of in closing, is this, and I mentioned that the structure of the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible are different. And one of the sort of macro level differences that I might note, and this is a result probably of my background as a literature teacher, is that the Christian Bible has a beginning, middle, and an end. And that structurally the Christian Bible is what classical rhetoric would have identified as a comedy. It ends in a marriage. The end of the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem descends from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. And there is foreseen the final resolution of all the conflicts between the human and the divine. And so there's a real sense of closure at the end of the Christian Bible. Anybody know where the Jewish Bible ends? It ends with the last chapter of the book of Chronicles, which nobody reads. Right? And the last thing recorded in the book of Chronicles is the proclamation of the Persian king Cyrus, who has defeated the Babylonians and is announcing that the Jews who were exiles in Babylon can return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. And that's the end. In other words, that it ends at a point that's clearly unfinished. There's a sort of open-endedness to that. And I think that's sort of the point of the story, that Judaism is very much a religion tied up with its history, and that history is understood as something that is ongoing and very much unfinished. Thank you.
Thank
So,
We'll have question and answer afterwards.
Okay.
Upstairs.
that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and stand up and sing the God chant. It's a call and response, so I'll sing, you sing right back. So it'll be easy breezy, and the words will be up here. All right, here we go. So I sing it, and you sing right back. God is the source of all I see.
God is the source of all I see.
God is the source in me.
God is the source in me.
God is the light in which I'm seeing.
God is the light in which I'm seeing.
God is the light in me.
God is the light in me.
God is the mind that I am thinking.
God is the mind that I am thinking.
God is the mind in me.
God is the mind in me.
God is the source and God is the light.
God is the source and God is the light.
God is the mind in me.
God is the mind in me.
God is the light in me.
God is the light in me.
God is the mind in me.
God is the mind in me.
All right, take a breath. God is the voice which I am hearing.
God is the voice which I am hearing.
God is the voice in me.
God is the voice in me.
God is the dance which I am dancing.
God is the dance which I am dancing.
God is the dance in me.
God is the dance in me.
God is the laughter I am laughing.
God is the laughter I am laughing.
God is the laugh in me.
God is the laugh in me.
God is the joy that I am feeling.
God is the joy which I am feeling.
God is the joy in me.
God is the joy in me.
God is the strength which I am trusting.
God is the strength which I am trusting.
God is the strength in me.
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 God is the strength